Welcome to the Deep Dive. Okay, picture this for a second. A country, right, sitting on the world's largest oil reserves. You'd think prosperity, right? Once one of Latin America's wealthiest nations. But now imagine that same place grappling with, catastrophic economic collapse, hyperinflation that's just off the charts, and a really devastating humanitarian crisis. It's such a dramatic fall. How does that even happen? We're talking, of course, about Venezuela, and today we're taking a deep dive into its story. It's a fascinating, but also really stark cautionary tale. Our mission here is to sort of unpack why Venezuela is seen as this archetype of a failed petrostate. We'll explore, the dangerous side of having all that resource wealth, get a handle on concepts like Dutch disease and the resource curse, and we'll trace the complex history, the economics, the politics that shaped Venezuela's path.
Exactly. And we're drawing on a really detailed report today. It covers Venezuela's ongoing crisis and gives us this rich picture, facts, figures, expert takes. It's a compelling look at how having one dominant resource can, profoundly shape a nation's future, sometimes in really challenging ways.
Okay, let's dive in then. We've already thrown around the term petrostate. So to maybe kick us off, what exactly is a petrostate, and what's this resource curse idea really about?
Right. Well, it's interesting. Petrostate isn't a formal definition, but it points to something very specific. Basically, it's a country where the government gets most, sometimes almost all of its money from exporting oil and natural gas. But the key thing, the insight, is what that dependency does. It often leads to economic and political power getting really concentrated, in the hands of a small elite. And you tend to see weak political institutions, not much accountability, and pretty widespread corruption almost follows naturally.
So it's not just having the oil. It's how that massive wealth fundamentally reshapes the state, the politics, everything. And Venezuela isn't unique in this, right? Our source mentions others.
No, definitely not unique. And that's important. To see it as a broader pattern, you can look at places like Algeria, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. Their stories are all different, of course, different contexts, but they often share these core traits. It's a surprisingly common setup.
Okay. And you mentioned something called Dutch disease. Sounds almost quaint, but it's actually a serious economic problem. Where did that name come from? What's the actual mechanism?
Yeah, the name's a bit misleading. It actually came about in the 1970s. The Netherlands found huge natural gas fields in the North Sea. And here's the mechanism. You get this sudden boom, like finding oil or gas. It pulls in tons of foreign money, foreign currency. This flood of cash makes the local currency stronger, which sounds good, right? But it means imports get cheaper and your own exports get more expensive for other countries to buy.
Okay, yeah, a strong currency, cheap imports, sounds like a plus. So where's the catch? What's the crucial downside here? How does that turn bad?
That's the core of it. The downside is that this process, this sudden wealth focused in one area, can hollow out the rest of the economy. It effectively sort of sucks the talent, the investment, the labor away from other important sectors. Think agriculture, manufacturing, the kinds of industries that employ a lot of people and build a diverse economy. So as those other sectors shrink, the country becomes dangerously dependent on just selling that one resource. And that makes you incredibly vulnerable when global prices for that resource swing up or down.
Right, it kills off diversity. You become a one-trick pony, economically speaking.
And super vulnerable.
Exactly. And some petrostates even find it easier to just tax foreign drillers heavily rather than develop their own production capacity.
Yeah.
That makes them even more exposed if those foreign companies pull out capital flight becomes a huge risk. Okay, so the Dutch disease explains the economic fragility. There's a deeper link here too, isn't there? How does relying on oil money, instead of, say, income taxes from citizens, change the whole relationship between the government and the people?
It fundamentally alters the social contract. If a government doesn't need to tax its people much because it's getting rich from oil exports, then it doesn't really need their consent or support in the same way. The lines of accountability get blurry or even break down. Leaders can then use that oil wealth not just to provide services, but also to buy loyalty, to silence opposition, maybe even repress it. Democratic checks and balances weaken.
So the money that frees the government from needing taxes also kind of frees it from needing to listen to its citizens. It breaks that essential democratic link.
Precisely. And Terry Lynn Carl, in her book The Paradox of Plenty, makes a really key point about timing. She argues, and I'm paraphrasing here, that many petrostates got hooked on oil right around the time they were trying to build democracy. So, establishing independent courts, a professional civil service, rule of law. All these things were still new and fragile. And Carl says that this timing makes the problem worse because these young institutions just aren't strong enough to manage the huge pressures and temptations that come with sudden oil wealth. It's like a system overload from the start.
Okay, so we've laid out the mechanics, the dangers of this resource curse. Now let's turn to Venezuela's story itself. It's this incredible century-long roller coaster. How did it all begin? Where's the starting point?
The real genesis, you could say, was 1922. That's when geologists from Royal Dutch Shell hit the jackpot at La Rosa in the Maracaibo Basin. And it wasn't just a discovery, it was a gusher. The well blew out at an unbelievable rate, something like 100,000 barrels a day.
100,000 barrels a day.
Yep.
Right from the first major find. That's just staggering. How quickly did that change things for Venezuela?
Almost instantly. It was transformative. Annual production just exploded. It went from about 1 million barrels to 137 million barrels by 1929. Think about that jump. Suddenly, Venezuela was the world's second biggest oil producer, only behind the U.S. And by 1935, the Dutch disease was already setting in. The currency, the bolivar, soared in value, imports flooded in. And oil just dominated everything, over 90% of all exports. Other sectors basically got sidelined.
So the wealth started pouring in, controlled mostly by foreign companies initially. The Venezuelan government must have started thinking, hey, we need a bigger slice of this pie.
Absolutely. In the early days, 3 big foreign players, Gulf, Shell, and Standard Oil, controlled almost everything, like 98% of the market. But the governments that followed the early dictators started pushing back. A really key moment was the 1943 hydrocarbons law. This law basically said foreign companies had to give half, 50% of their oil profits to the Venezuelan state. And the impact was huge. Within just 5 years, the government's oil income shot up 6 times. They were successfully reclaiming the rents, as economists say.
Okay, so the state starts getting a much bigger share. But then comes another crucial phase. After years of instability and military rule, there's the 1958 Punto Fijo Pact. This was supposed to bring democratic stability. How did that political deal affect the oil money?
Well, the pact did aim for stability, bringing the main political parties together. But a key part of the deal was how they'd manage the spoils, including state jobs and, crucially, the oil revenues. These were essentially divided up among the major parties based on election results. So it concentrated the control and distribution of oil wealth within the state and the party system, rather than maybe using it to build a more diverse, independent economy. Then, just 2 years later, in 1960, Venezuela co-founds OPEC. This gives it even more leverage over global prices and strengthens state control over the industry. They set up their first state oil company around then, too. The state was now firmly in the driver's seat of the oil economy.
And then the 1970s hit. That was like hitting the jackpot for OPEC countries, right?
Yeah.
Oil prices went through the roof.
Oh, absolutely. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo caused prices to quadruple. For Venezuela, this was a massive windfall. Suddenly, it had the highest income per person in all of Latin America. Over just a couple of years, an extra $10 billion flowed into the state's treasury. But there was a really dark side to this boom. Corruption exploded. Analysts estimate, and this figure is just mind-boggling, that maybe as much as $100 billion was embezzled between roughly 1972 and 1997.
$100 billion. Embezzled. It's almost impossible to grasp. How does a country even function when that much wealth is just disappearing?
It's staggering. Think of the lost opportunities, the schools, hospitals, roads that never got built. The trust that was eroded. It didn't just make a few people rich. It fundamentally undermined the country's potential for decades. And right in the middle of this boom, in 1976, President Carlos Andrés Pérez nationalized the entire oil industry. That's when the big state oil company Petroleos de Venezuela, SA PDVSA, was created.
But PDVSA wasn't initially set up just as a government department, was it? There was a specific idea behind its structure.
That's a crucial point, yes. Initially, PDVSA was designed to operate more like a commercial business. It was meant to be run professionally, with some independence from direct political meddling. It could even partner with foreign companies, provided the state kept a majority stake, like 60%. The idea was efficiency, expertise, but that structure wouldn't last.
So the 70s were this incredible boom time, this kind of golden era fueled by oil. But booms based on commodity prices rarely last forever. The 1980s saw a big shift, right? An oil glut. How did Venezuela cope with that downturn?
It was a harsh reversal. Global oil prices tanked in the 80s. And because Venezuela was so dependent, the impact was severe. The economy shrank. Inflation climbed sharply. The government piled up huge amounts of foreign debt, partly from buying assets overseas, like the Citgo refineries in the U.S. By 1989, things were so bad that President Pérez, who had actually been president during the boom years and got reelected, had to impose an austerity package demanded by the IMF. And those austerity measures led to tragedy. Deadly riots erupted the Caracazo. This deep public anger and instability really set the stage for what came next.
which was Hugo Chávez. He tried a coup in '92, failed, but became this national figure, and then he won the presidency in 1998.
Exactly. He tapped into that widespread discontent. He came in with his Bolivarian Revolution, a socialist platform promising to use the oil wealth differently to fight poverty, reduce inequality.
And did he deliver on that, at least initially?
In some ways, yes, especially early on. His government launched these social programs called Bolivarian missions, focused on health, education, food subsidies. And they did have an impact. Poverty levels were cut by about 20% during his time. However, and this is critical, it was also under Chavez that several key decisions were made that ultimately started Venezuela's oil production on a long, steady decline. Decisions that planted the seeds for the later collapse.
Right. You mentioned the poverty reduction, but also these damaging decisions. What were the biggest missteps that hurt oil production so badly?
Well, a really big one was after an oil industry strike in 2002-2003. Chavez responded by firing thousands, literally thousands, of experienced PDVSA managers, engineers, and workers. This was largely seen as a political move to consolidate control, but it gutted PDVSA of irreplaceable technical know-how. You could argue the company never really recovered from that brain drain. Then, starting around 2005, he launched the Petrocaribe initiative. This meant sending lots of oil, heavily subsidized, sometimes effectively given away, to friendly countries in the Caribbean and Central America. Great for diplomacy, maybe, but a huge drain on Venezuela's own resources. So while spending went up, investment in PDVSA itself lagged. The country's strategic reserves dwindled, and government debt actually doubled during his presidency, despite high oil prices for much of it. Political goals consistently trumped sound management of the core industry.
And it wasn't just the economic management. Chávez's time also saw a pretty clear shift towards more authoritarian rule, didn't it? What did that look like?
Absolutely. He used his popularity and the oil money very effectively to concentrate power. He pushed through constitutional changes that expanded presidential powers, abolished term limits so he could run indefinitely. He gained control over the Supreme Court, undermining judicial independence. There was increasing harassment of independent media. And significantly, his government nationalized hundreds of private companies, including taking over major oil projects run by international giants like ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. This really scared off foreign investment. All of this dismantled checks and balances and, unfortunately, really smoothed the path for his successor, Nicolás Maduro, to consolidate power even further and slide into what many describe as a full dictatorship after Chavez died.
Okay, so that brings us to the current era under Nicolás Maduro. We've seen how the stage was set, how did things spiral downward so rapidly after Chavez, especially when oil prices crashed again.
Yeah, the transition was rough, and then the external shock hit hard. Global oil prices started tumbling again in mid-2014. For Venezuela's already strained economy, this was devastating. It went into complete freefall. Maduro's response wasn't economic reform, really, but political consolidation. More repression, cracking down on dissent, controlling the media, manipulating elections. His re-election in 2018 was widely seen internationally as illegitimate. That's when dozens of countries, including the U.S., took the step of recognizing the opposition leader, Juan Guaidó, as the interim president. It led to this really strange situation with two competing claims to leadership and deepened Venezuela's isolation.
The statistics from this period, they paint a truly bleak picture of collapse. It's not just numbers, it's human suffering on a massive scale.
The numbers are just staggering. The country's entire economic output, the GDP, shrank by about 75% 3/4 between 2014 and 2021. Imagine an economy just evaporating like that. Businesses closed, jobs vanished. Then there was hyperinflation. It peaked at over 130,000% in 2018. 130,000%. Even in 2023, it was still around 190%.
190% inflation. I mean, just trying to wrap your head around that. Your money becoming worthless almost overnight, people unable to afford food, medicine. The human impact must be immense.
It's almost unimaginable. And on top of that, you have this crushing national debt estimated at $150 billion or maybe even more, all while the main source of income, oil, keeps declining because of years of mismanagement and lack of investment in PDVSA. So you get these severe shortages of absolutely basic things: food, clean water, gasoline, medicine. A survey in 2022 found half the population living in poverty.
And this unbelievable hardship has obviously driven millions of people to leave the country.
Yes, it's fueled one of the largest refugee crises in the world. Nearly 8 million Venezuelans have fled since 2014. 8 million people. That number alone tells you the scale of the desperation.
Now, the U.S. and other countries have imposed sanctions for years. How much impact have those had? Have they really isolated Maduro?
The U.S. sanctions have been pretty sweeping, particularly targeting the oil sector, blocking imports from PDVSA, cutting off the government's access to the U.S. financial system. But Maduro's government hasn't completely collapsed. It's managed to stay afloat, partly thanks to support political and economic lifelines from countries like China, Russia, Iran, Cuba, and Turkey. They've provided loans, investment, and ways to bypass some of the sanctions.
We've also seen some movement on the sanctions front recently, kind of back and forth. What's been happening there?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a diplomatic dance. In late 2022, the U.S. eased things slightly, allowing Chevron to resume some limited oil production. The idea was partly to help global energy markets, but also conditional on Maduro restarting talks with the opposition. Then, in October 2023, more sanctions were eased after the government in Caracas agreed to a roadmap for holding a more competitive presidential election in 2024. But that didn't last long. By April 2024, the U.S. reimposed many sanctions, saying Maduro hadn't met the conditions for a fair election. There was also rising tension over Venezuela's claims to the oil-rich Essequibo region belonging to neighboring Guyana. And then the July 2024 election itself just deepened the divide, with widespread concerns about fairness and both sides claiming victory, so relations remain very strained.
So considering this whole tangled history, the current crisis, the geopolitical complexities, is there any way out? Can Venezuela or any country caught in this Petrostate trap actually escape the oil curse?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe the billion-barrel question. The source material does offer some perspective here. It highlights that countries discovering resources after they already have strong, established democratic institutions tend to fare much better.
That's the Norway example, right?
Right.
They found oil, but they already had robust democracy, checks and balances.
Exactly. Norway is the classic case study. Strong democratic traditions, an independent press, a trusted judiciary. These were all in place before the North Sea oil boom. This allowed them to manage the wealth much more responsibly, set up mechanisms for transparency, and ensure the benefits were broadly shared. Today, oil is important, but it's projected to be only about 20% of their GDP in 2024. They avoided the curse because the foundations were solid.
Okay, so Norway provides a model. But what about countries like Venezuela that are already deep in the trap? Are there any remedies? What can be done?
Well, experts like Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University argue the main goal has to be using any oil revenue you do get much more wisely. Instead of just funding consumption or patronage, invest it in public goods that build a foundation for future growth, things like infrastructure, education, healthcare, things that support private sector diversification down the line. And transparency is absolutely key in all of this. People need to know where the money is coming from and where it's going. Another tool many countries use now are sovereign wealth funds, or SWFs. These are state-owned funds created to invest the resource revenues for the long term, smoothing out booms and busts, and providing income after the resource runs out. Norway's fund is huge, but many others, like Saudi Arabia's, are also massive. Global SWF assets were over $11 trillion in 2023.
But for Venezuela right now, the hurdles seem immense. Diversifying seems like a huge challenge, especially with the world slowly moving away from fossil fuels anyway.
It's incredibly difficult for Venezuela. Yes, the scale of the economic collapse is just so vast. Diversification needs massive investment, but who wants to invest heavily given the political instability, the uncertainty about future oil demand, and growing climate concerns? The tragic irony is that Venezuela probably needs to somehow revive its oil sector first, just to generate the money and stability needed to even start building other industries. It's a really deep hole to climb out of.
Venezuela's story. It really is such a stark reminder. All that incredible natural wealth, the world's largest reserves, becoming a curse, not a blessing, because the institutional framework, the economic strategy, just wasn't there or was undermined. It's this tangled web of geology, economics, politics, playing out over a whole century.
Yeah, and what's really striking when you look at it is how all these different threads connect. That initial oil discovery in 1922, the political deals made decades later, global price shocks, specific policy choices made by leaders like Chávez, international sanctions. None of these happened in isolation. They all influenced each other, creating this path dependency that led Venezuela to where it is now. It really shows how interconnected everything is in shaping a nation's fate.
So for you listening right now, what's the takeaway here? Venezuela's story is cautionary, for sure. But what does it tell us? Not just about other countries with oil, maybe, but about any country, any organization even. It makes you think, doesn't it? About the risks of relying too much on one thing, whether it's a resource, an industry, whatever. And maybe more importantly, it highlights just how crucial those often unglamorous things, strong, transparent institutions, accountability, adaptability really are. They're not optional extras. They might be the difference between prosperity and collapse. Something to chew on.